morning. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Extended Day Ahead Market EDAM workshop meeting to discuss transfer revenue and congestion rent allocation. My name is Brenda Corona, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the California ISO. I'll be facilitating today's meeting, and I'm also joined by James Lin, who is our Senior Advisor, Market Settlement Design, Miloš Vasanek for the Regional Market Sector Manager, and Partha Markovar for the Principal RA Infrastructure and Grid Management. The presentation and other related materials can be found on the EDAM Initiative webpage, as well as these slides. After my welcome, I will be going over the quick agenda for today, and we'll proceed to discussion of the transfer revenue congestion rent allocation. We will have about 15-minute break, depending on the time we are spending on this topic, but we will go ahead and proceed with the topic followed by the transfer revenue congestion rent sub-allocation. At this time, we're having James come up online. He's having a little bit of technical issues, so in the meantime, I will have Miloš speak on the next slide after my housekeeping slide. So for a reminder for this workshop is stimulate open dialogue and also leverage different perspectives with the goal of designing solutions to an outstanding EDAM design issue. This call is also being recorded for information and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. But if you do experience any technical issues during the meeting, please send us chat to our event producer and myself, and we'll be able to assist you. And thanks again for joining us for our engaging discussion today. And for that, I'll go ahead and bring Miloš to go ahead and discuss the EDAM milestone.
Thank you, Brenda, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for joining us bright and early, 8 a.m. For a second day in a row. We know it's not easy, and we certainly appreciate you all taking the time. And I just wanted to highlight kind of where we are in the process and really acknowledge and express our gratitude for the stakeholder engagement on these workshops that now started last week on July 11th. We're down the home stretch. We have a couple of more workshops next week, and we hope to see you all or join us virtually if you have a chance. And we'll talk about the different topics at the end of the meeting that are coming up on the workshop. So I really just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge everybody's participation in the workshop so far. I know we've covered a lot of topics over the last 2 weeks now. On July 11th, we talked about transmission in bucket 2. Then towards the end of last week, on Thursday and Friday, we dedicated time to talk about different aspects of the resource sufficiency evaluation. Yesterday, we came back to transmission and talked about bucket 3 transmission. And then today, we're focusing it on the transfer revenue and congestion rent allocation. I know that these are meaty topics, and we talked a lot about a number of different aspects informed by the comments that you've provided. And I just wanted to encourage folks that coming out of these workshops, to the extent that you have any questions or you want to engage with us offline and share your perspectives, we're certainly open to that, and we encourage you to do that. Reach out to myself or reach out to any one of our policy leads that have been presenting these materials. And again, we'd be happy to get together with you, provide clarification, and hear some of your perspectives as we prepare for the publication of the revised STRA proposal on August 11th. I would encourage the stakeholder community as well to continue engaging amongst yourselves, talking about some of these important topics. And like I said, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to get together with you to talk about any of your perspectives on anything that you may have heard during these last few workshops, including the workshops that are coming up next week. So just wanted to, again, encourage that engagement, similar to the engagement that we had in the working groups a few months back. I think that's going to be an important part of the overall process as we synthesize your comments and take some of the feedback from these workshops to help inform that publication of the revised STRA proposal. With that, again, thank you everybody for taking the time bright and early on these last couple of days to join us. We hope to see you on July 26th and 27th, whether in virtual or in person. But if you have any questions or anything like that, please feel free to reach out to us. With that, let me turn it over to James Lin, who's going to walk us through the presentation today. And let's see here. I think James Lin just came back on. James, are you able to hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm also able to moved over on my computer. So I'm in there in probably 2 sessions.
All right. Yeah.
So
No
I'm probably
problem.
going to hang up on one.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead and I just want to confirm you're good to go.
Yeah. Give me a quick second to
All
switch over.
right.
For those who are online, just a reminder, for those who have questions during the call, please make sure you use your raise hand icon above your chat window in WebEx. And if you join via audio, press #2 on your device. And before you speak, please state your name and affiliation first, and we will also answer all chat questions from all panelists.
Brenda, can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, I can confirm. I can hear you.
Okay, so let me end my other session, and then we will begin. Good morning, everybody. It has already started out as a fun-filled morning. Right before, as I tried to connect, my server froze up on me. So took me a little bit to get back in here, but I think we're ready to move forward. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I also want to thank everybody for your comments. Transfer revenue is a meaty topic that we're going to get into. And I look forward to our discussions today. And as part of the discussions, we're going to cover a little bit of refresher. And what I mean by the transfer revenue refresher, it is going to be a review of the original straw proposal that the ISO has put out, and particularly a little discussion on the distinction between the various transfer types. And from there, we'll go over the transfer revenue, congestion, rent allocation with examples. So I'm hoping that in this particular section, I will go through the various scenarios that can result. One with just have bucket 1 transition, another one with bucket 2, and then a situation where a BAA can have an internal constraint that's binding the participation of non-EDAM BAA areas along with EDAM BAA areas. And then I will reference it in the slides to the ISO straw proposal, and then after that we'll start discussing about the comments and have some more discussion as to what we believe is the right way of handling both transfer revenue and congestion rents. After that, one of the other areas we're going to talk about is a little bit on the transfer revenue congestion rent sub-allocation. This was in several of the comments. There was a request to revisit this, at least from a discussion perspective, and I think this was a perfect opportunity as working group is to have this discussion to see if what the merits of allocating these to the EDAM entity and let them do the sub-allocation versus allocating it directly to the transmission customer. And this is more along the line of bucket 2 transmission and or just allocation to overall metro demand if there's leftover rents. So let's start off with the refresher. Okay, so as a refresher, we will all know that when we come into the EDAM market, bucket 1, 2, and 3 transmission is being made available to EDAM. Because it's being made available to EDAM, that it is eligible for transfer revenue allocation. This was potentially for energy, imbalance reserve, and reliability capacity. In our further discussion, we're going to focus on the energy transfer revenue, just to simplify the discussion. I also wanted to understand that transfer revenue is collected when you have a transfer constraint that is binding. And again, this could happen in energy, imbalance reserve, or reliability capacity. As it binds, you get a separation in the energy cost between the two balance utility areas. And that is energy cost separation is what is going to result in the collection collection of transfer revenue. In WEIM or WEAM, this cost is currently being embedded in the marginal cost of congestion. With EDAM, we're looking to separate these so you have a clear distinction as to what is causing transfer revenue, or when the transfer constraint finds, versus when you have an internal constraint that finds, including the intertie constraint, which will result in congestion rent. So as I put in the bullet here, congestion rent collected when internal constraints bind, both for energy price difference, causing energy price separation between the two BAs. As part of the straw proposal, we asked participants to provide input and feedback on the overall ISO proposal on transfer revenue congestion rent allocation methodology. This allocation methodology makes a very clear distinction between the various different types of transfers. If it is between a transfer in which you have chosen a transfer point that is midway between the two BAAs, then you're both providing transmission to that point, so it's a 50-50 split. If it's the transfer location is at a transfer point or a scheduling point at the one of the associated BAAs, then it gets into a different type of allocation. It would be 100% to the BAA that is providing that transmission to that transfer point, and then 0% to the BAA, which is associated with that scheduling point or transfer point. Now, congestion rent, as we said here, was going to be treated across all BAAs as internal constraint, and therefore it should remain within the BAA which it resides. So next couple slides, if we go to the next slide, please. We're going to talk a little about what we're going to discuss, and then I'm going to go into more detail of these three examples or the distinctions we made on the transfer location. The ISO, as I said, we made a distinction on types. We have called transfer through, and that references when you have two BAAs have chosen to have a transfer location that's midway between the two BAAs. A transfer mix, which is a combination of a transfer through and transfer to, which means it's a transfer location that is not quite at the scheduling point, but it is between some point between the two BAAs. But there's additional transmission that's being provided by the other BAA to get to the scheduling point. So you have a little bit of a separation between the transfer location and the scheduling point location. And so this is considered a mix. And under those circumstances, the transfer revenue is split 50-50 and the congestion rent is 100% internal. A transfer to is the other extreme. You took all the transmission, you chose the transfer location at the scheduling point in another BAA, and I think I've already described that already, but it's 100% to the BAA that provides the transmission to that scheduling point or that transfer point at the boundary, and then the congestion rent still maintains internally. So this little discussion we just had should make the next 4 slides relatively easy and quick to go through. It's a graphical demonstration of what I just talked about. Please go to the next slide. So this is the transfer through. And you can see that the scheduling point is at the boundary of the BAA, it's considered internal. But the two balancing authority areas have chosen a transfer location that is midway or some way along the line between the two BAAs. And this transfer location means that both BAAs are providing the transmission, and therefore both BAAs are eligible for the transfer revenue. Now, the default mechanism is we're assuming from a default perspective that it's at the midway point, and therefore the proration should be 50-50 split of the transfer revenue between the two balanced authority areas. And you're not competing in this scenario. You're also not competing with any non-EDAM intertie schedules. So that's why it is more of a strictly a 50-50 split. If we go to the next slide, this is our mixed scenario. As you see that you've chosen a transfer location that is between the two balancing authority areas, but the non-EDAM BAA is competing with the EDAM BAA, and in this case, BAA has to provide additional transmission to get from that scheduling point or the transfer point to the scheduling point, so we can make an analysis or determination if when the non-EDAM BAA schedules and the EDAM transfers are competing at that scheduling point, that if it finds that the congestion, that we limit it within that balancing authority area, the amount of energy that can come in. Now, what this means is the transfer revenue is split 50-50, but the intertie constraint or the internal constraint is going to remain within that BAA, because you have gotten beyond the transfer location and you are within the BAA when you do that additional scheduling limit. The last one is the last two slides are examples of transfer through, or two, I mean, in this example versus the next one, is whether or not it's to the scheduling point or to a transfer point that's at the boundary. They're very similar. In essence, you can have competing with the non-EDAM BAA or non-competing, but the BAB in this scenario has provided all the transmission to get to that scheduling point, where we are now making the assumption or the analysis as to when competing with the non-EDAM BAA, have we exceeded the scheduling limit internal to BAA? And it is both of these two scenarios. The transfer revenue is going to have 100% allocation to BAB, but the congestion rates would stay in BAA because you have gotten beyond the transfer point and you're now looking at internal congestion. Go to the next slide. This is a similar situation. This one, instead of having non-EDAM BA, you basically, the EDAM BA brought all the transmission to transfer location at BAA boundary. All right, so this is a little bit of a refresher. We go to the next slide for a quick one, make sure I'm at. All right, we'll go to the stakeholders' comments. But I want to, before I start talking about the stakeholders' comments, I want to see if there's any questions on our little refresher from the straw proposal. So I'm opening it up at this point to the audience.
For those who are
go
ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Brenda.
For those who are connected,
Sure.
please make sure you put #2 on your device. If not, please raise your hand so we can know that you would like to ask a question. And at this time, I don't see anyone submitted anything in chat.
Okay. So in review of our stakeholder comments, the comments seem to focus on two key areas when related to transfer revenue. And, oh, please, if I'm going through this too fast, please let me know as well. I tend to speak quickly to slides. But the two areas that were talked about were the transfer revenue and congestion rent allocation. And that references to the previous slide, whether or not we should make a distinction between the transfer revenues or the transfer locations, or whether or not we should be consistent across the entire EDAM footprint and apply a single methodology to the transfer location. The second discussion was related to the sub-allocation of the transfer revenue. Now, the straw proposal we are proposing to allocate these to the EDAM VAA, the EDAM entity, and then have the EDAM entity sub-allocate to its transmission customers. However, several of the comments was requested that we open this up as part of a work group for future discussion. So this is an opportunity to discuss that. Now, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to start addressing the transfer revenue. This is the transfer revenue and congestion rent allocation with examples. And so please, next slide. So the comments we received, there was basically three groups. And I'm excluding no comments from this grouping, but the first group believe, and it was a larger majority of the participants advocated that transfer revenue and congestion rent allocation be consistent across all of the transfer locations. Do not make the distinction. And in this consistency, they believe that the transfer revenue should be shared 50-50 between the two BAAs, and that the congestion rents are considered internal constraints and should be allocated to the BAA for that BAA to sub-allocate it further. Some participants requested that there was a one or two, by the way, that said that the congestion rents and the transfer revenue should be 50-50 across all the BAs consistently. Some participants requested an opportunity to review more examples and before formulating a finalized opinion. And then we had a couple that completely supported the distinction between the transfer locations. Now, when we go through the next slide, you'll find out that I created examples that was more aligned with the straw proposal for the reason that we had several participants that wanted to review the examples of the straw proposal in further detail before coming up with final position. At the end of it, we are going to just have a little discussion as to whether or not it merits to have a distinction between the transfer locations, or if we should have a consistent message across the entire EDAM footprint. Now, this slide here, we basically are doing a distinction again. I mentioned it earlier, but what is transfer revenue? Transfer revenue is money that's collected when you have a transfer constraint that binds. And what I mean by binding is you've gotten to the limits of that transfer, and you now have to, the cost of the energy within one balancing authority area versus another is getting higher because it is having to use internal transmission within that balancing authority area to solve for additional load forecast changes. And this causes a separation of energy. I could have one BAA, and we'll go through this example. One BAA is $30 for energy, and the other BAA is $60. And that's because I can't send any more energy from the BAA with $30 to the BAA that has the need for additional load. So we're going up the big curve within that BAA that's binding. The congestion rents, though, is I can have it when the internal constraint, you're getting to a scheduling point with inside a balancing authority area, and you're now analyzing non-EDAM BAA schedules or bids with an EDAM transfer. And when that's binding, you will establish additional congestion within that BAA because I'm going to limit something. I'm either going to limit the transfer, which could result in less transfers coming through, or I can limit the non-EDAM BAA intertie schedules. So let's go up to the first example. Okay, this is just a very simple example. It's a transfer. We can say bucket one. This is we only have a single transfer between the two BAAs. It is all of the hurdle-free, and I put bucket 1 here, but really this is just hurdle-free. This could be bucket 3 transmission that is being turned over hurdle-free, or straight bucket 1 RSC transmission. But I have transfers that go from BAA B to BAA that transfer ETSR 1 to ETSR 2. And then I also have a transfer pair of ETSR 5 to ETSR 6. I'm going to explain why we're describing this in pairs in a minute. But we also have a system resource that's at BAA. That system resource is not competing with the transfer. It's just it's at another intertie location associated with BAA under this example. Each BAA has 2 generators that bid into the market. Each BAA has load, and they have provided the available transmission capacity across the ETSRs. And what you can see is BAA is actually providing 200 megawatts of transmission, but because BAB only can provide 100 megawatts of export transmission, I have to limit the import direction, which would be ETSR 1 to ETSR 2, to 100 megawatts. Same thing occurs, but with the second ETSR pair, which is ETSR 5 and 6. They are both emitting 100 megawatts of available transmission. Now, the reason why we set it up as pairs is the way the market analyzes, the way settlement sees it. You need to have an import direction from, let's say in this case, it's an export direction from BAB, showing that energy is transferring out of BAB, but it also has to have what we call mirror import direction into BAA. This allows us to analyze those scheduled flows or the transfer flows across that transfer location. Now, they're established as 2 separate resources, and they have a very clear link to each other. And this is so that if you provide the ATC, you can provide it strictly on that ETSR pair if you wanted to tell us exactly how much transmission capacity is being made available for hurdle-free. And then we'll go into a little bit further when I get into having a bucket 2 transition. So the same thing occurs when I have the flow of energy going the opposite direction, is we establish an ETSR pair that shows that energy flow as well. That's ETSR 5 and 6. So if I go to the setup, now if I go next slide, here's the inputs into the market. The system resource in BAAA is submitted 200 megawatts. It's a price taker. It didn't put a bid in, so it is going to take whatever price the market clears at. Gen 1 has P-max availability of 600 megawatts, but they're bidding in the full capability at $60. They're also bidding in 100 megawatts of bid for imbalance reserve at $5. Gen 2 is bidding in 500 megawatts at $40 for energy, 100 megawatts for imbalance reserve at $4. Load is bidding in at $800, but it's a price taker. It's self-scheduling it. And under imbalance reserve, you'll see it says 100 with an asterisk. This is to represent the imbalance reserve requirement. So each balancing authority area has a requirement of 100 megawatts for imbalance reserve up. We could have complicated it by looking at imbalance reserve down, reliability capacity up and down. I'm trying to simplify it a little bit. In BAB, we have generator 3 and 4 both have max capability of 500 megawatts. They're bidding in their complete capability. Gen 3 is bidding in at $20. Gen 4 is bidding in at $30. They're also bidding in for the 100 megawatts of imbalance reserve requirement. So it's 100 megawatt bid in for both. Gen 3 is bidding in at $3, Gen 2 at $2, and the load within BAB is self-scheduling at 550 megawatts. Now, as I showed earlier, the ETSR limit is 100 megawatts each. So now if we take all this data in the market, the integrated forward market does an optimization, the results are going to look like the next slide. The system resource is going to get awarded 200 megawatts because it's a price taker. Generator 1 is not being awarded any energy, but as we'll go, if we look into it a little more deeply, Generator 1 sets the marginal energy cost within BAA. And this is because Generator 2, we have used up its full capability, and we dispatched to meet the 800 megawatts and as you can, of load within that BAA. As you can see, though, there is 100 megawatts short within that BAA. And that's because Generator 3 and 4 were dispatched to meet both the load within BAB, but also to transfer energy from BAB to BAA. And it's 100 megawatt transfers. So in addition, though, when it comes, because the BAA Generator 2 was fully used for energy, and we made up the difference of that energy from BAB, Generator 1 can be awarded the 100 megawatts of imbalance reserve at marginal price of $5. Generator 4 within that BAAB is being awarded 100 megawatts at $2. Now, we don't have any imbalance reserve transfer because all of the transfer capability is being used up by the energy. And so when it comes to the settlement, and we'll go back into the graphical picture here, so on the next slide, this gives us an idea of what is the settlement within the two BAAs and what is the calculation of transfer revenue. We'll start out with BAA. System resource is paid $12,000 for the 200 megawatts it is providing to meet the load within BAA. So that's up to $60. Generator 2 is being paid $30,000 for its energy, and then the ETSR, ETSR2 in this case, is also being settled at 100 megawatts at the $60 because it is providing energy to serve the load within BAA, and its marginal energy price is $60. The load is being charged $48,000 for its 800 megawatts, and we're assuming also the marginal energy price is $60. In addition, Gen 1 gets a payment for $500 for its imbalance reserve, 100 megawatt imbalance reserve it's receiving. Now, BAA is now balanced. Now we look over at BAB, I have Gen 3 is being paid for energy for $15,000. Gen 4 is being paid a total of $4,700 for energy and imbalance reserve, $4,500 for energy, $200 for imbalance reserve. The ETSR export is being charged at $3,000 for the 100 megawatt is exporting out of that balancing authority area, and load is being charged $16,500. Now, BAB is now balanced. The energy settlement is balanced between the generation, the ETSR, and the load within BAB, same with BAA. Now, but we have this price separation here between the two BAAs that is resulting based upon that transfer. I am paying out $6,000 for that energy coming in, but I'm charging only $3,000 for the energy leaving. This is the transfer revenue. So I have $3,000 transfer revenue that is collected to facilitate this 100 megawatt transfer under this through scenario. And under the through scenario, because it's at the midway point, we are going to split the cost for this revenue to the two BAAs at $1,500 apiece. Now, I'm not going to get into sub-allocation, but right now, both these BAAs will receive $1,500 of transfer revenue for that transfer of the 100 megawatts from BAAB to BAA. If you go to the next slide, similar situation, but now it's a transfer two. And all this means is that the transfer location is at the boundary of BAA, and BAB is providing all the transmission to get to that boundary. Under this scenario, the transfer revenue goes all the way to BAB, and then BAA gets $0. I'm going to have a similar set of examples we're going to walk through for when we bring in bucket 2 transmission, and another step when I have an internal constraint at the ISL. But I want to open up at this point to see if there's any questions or any clarifying comments that you would like to have for this first example.
As a reminder, if you're connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. You can also submit your question in the chat. To submit written question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and send. I do see one caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, James. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. Thank you for putting these examples together. It really helps, I think, frame it at a higher conceptual level, how all these pieces will work together. I just have a clarifying question. So I'm trying to compare your examples of the transfer through and the transfer to. And that when you walk through the transfer through and how it set the limit to 100 megawatts in both directions, it was set to 100 because you took the minimum of what BAA provided and BAB provided.
Correct.
Now on the transfer to, do you do the same where you look at what both BAs provided and take the minimum, or because it's a transfer to, only one BAA, if I think in this example, BAB would provide all of the transfer capability and you don't have to take a minimum, which is why it's a transfer to?
Good question, but more, and the answer is going to be we're going to look at both. BAA is still going to tell us how much transmission is available at that transfer location or that scheduling point. And in this particular case, it's a transfer location. So we will have a limit in both directions. All it means is that I still have to compare the two transmissions to show that, yes, BAB is providing 100 megawatts all the way to the transfer location. Now, when it goes into the BAA, how much available transmission is at that location? And at that location, it's also considered 100 megawatts, or it was 200 megawatts, but because they're still doing a transfer there, I'm going to limit the transfer to the minimum of the two.
Okay, yeah, I'm trying to think through because, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, but both BAs have to tell us what the available transmission at that transfer location.
Okay, yeah, I'm following the logic, I think, on why in the transfer to location all of the revenue goes to BAB, but it sounds like BAA is still providing some transfer capability even in the transfer to scenario. So maybe I'll wait for you to go through that example, and hopefully it'll click.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So
I'll defer.
In all situations, this was our original proposal. Is if I'm providing all the transmission to that boundary, I still, once you get to that transfer location associated with BAA, there still has to be a corresponding transmission on the other side. I still cannot just automatically assume that I now can get 200 megawatts. I'm still limited by the BAA transmission because I still can only bring in 100 megawatts at this location. So we'll both BAAs is going to tell us what the available transmission at that transfer location. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that that transfer location can be anywhere along that transfer path. As you get down to the point where you're at that transfer path of the transfer location is at the farthest end, then VAB should get the transfer revenue. Now that's our original thought, and that this is a carryover from WEAM or WEAM on how we do our distribution of congestion rents overall. It's a similar idea, is that if the transfer location or the scheduling point is at basically the boundary of the BAA, then BAB provided all the major transmission to get there and should receive the transfer revenue. But thank you for your question, Callie.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I think that helped, and I'm sure it'll make a little bit more sense as we go through the different examples, but thanks.
Thank you.
I do not see any other callers in the queue, but I see a question in the chat.
Yes, I could go ahead and read that question, James. It's from Kelly Moore from NV Energy, and she asked, in this example, how is it decided if this would be a transfer to or through? Does the market solution select whether the transmission would be to or through?
So what we do, and this is part of our current onboarding process, so as you're onboarding into the EDAM, and we're establishing these ETSR pairs in master file, that's what we're making that determination. Is we're in the discussion, because you're going to have both BAB and BAA in the discussion as to what is the transfer location for these ETSR pairs, what is the max limit of the ETSR pair, and then whether or not it's transfer to versus transfer through. And so based upon this is done during the onboarding process. I don't know if there's any other chat questions.
No more chat questions at this time.
Just so you guys know, I tried to do video, but lucky for you, the video only showed the background. It didn't show me. So I turned off my video again. But going on to the next example, this is one where we bring in bucket 2. Now in this case, we now have 2 transfers that can go between, that can export out of BAB and import into BAA. One of those transfers is associated with a transmission customer, and that transmission customer can self-schedule their right to flow across the BAB to BAA. That one is being represented by ETSR3, ETSR4 pair. I'll go into a little more detail what the limit on that one is. But then everything else set up is pretty much the same. The system resources still have another inter-location not competing. The still only 2 generations in both BAAs, and then we have our load. And then the available transmission limit across this import is 100 megawatts. Now what's key here is the limit going from BAB to BAA is 100 megawatts. that limit is across both ETSR1 2 pair and ETS3 4 pair. That means these two pairs cannot exceed 100 megawatts. And you'll see that in the solution, and I want to call that out now because it actually gives you an idea of how that can be limited by, and potentially have a cause for redispatch costs in real time. But you go to the next scenario or the next slide, the setup. Everything is pretty much the same. The only difference is I have ETSR3, the transmission rights customer, the TR, is self-scheduling 75 megawatts from BAA-B to BAA-A. And it is going from generator 4, so that's a self-schedule from, so when they go into the market, you'll see a self-schedule from generator 4 to the ETSR3 export, and then a self-schedule from ETSR4 import to load 1 of 75 megawatts. So you'll have the self-schedule showing that this is being used by the transmission customer. And when we come to the solution, you'll see the only thing that really changed is that the ETSRs, I no longer am using the bucket 1 transmission to full 100 megawatts of the transfer capability because 75 was being used by the transmission customer, and now to get to the limit, I can only use an additional 25 megawatts of transfer capability. And in this case, it was being utilized by the bucket 1 transmission to get from BA-B to BAA. Everything else stays the same. And so now when we go to the solution, which is on the next slide, or the actual dollar settlement, I have to settle the ETSR separately. So in BAA, nothing changed for generator 1 and 2. System resource didn't change. Load is still being charged $48,000. But the ETSR is now being split between the pair ETSR1 to ETSR2, and then the transmission customers right, which is ETSR3 to 4. So it is receiving payments of $1,500 on ETSR2, $4,500 on ETSR4. In BAB, the generator loads settlement didn't change, but the ETSR did. I'm charging $750 on ETSR1 and $2,250 on ETSR3. Now, what this creates is transfer 1 is the ETSR1 2. It has a transfer revenue of $750. Now, this is associated with the EDAM entity, so this will go directly to the EDAM entity. Now, the ETSR3, it's $2,250. Now, the ISO has proposed that this $2,250 would go to the EDAM entity so that EDAM entity can then true it up with its transmission customer. What makes this unique is if this is a through, is this $750 and $2,250 is split 50-50. So both BAAs are going to have to true up with the transmission customer for that $2,250. And the $750 is going to be allocated as the BAA say through the route. And so this is a little bit of a distinction that when you have a through scenario, the transmission customer is going to receive transfer revenue payment from both BAA and BAB because you had the right to go through BAB to BAA, and then so this transfer revenue should be used to make you whole. And this is on the through, and on the to scenario, we're back to you're now only having to deal with one BAA. In this case, it's BAB, because the full $3,000 transfer revenue is going to be allocated to BAB, and then BAAB will true up to $2,250 to the transmission customer. Now, there's a little bit of a nuance change, so I'm going to open it up again for any questions on this scenario. And I'm opening it up because I want to get this understanding clear before we move on to our full discussion.
As a reminder, if you're using the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you can enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. You can also submit your question in the chat. To do so, please select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel. Enter your question in the message box further and send. I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Thank you very much for these examples. I think they're really helpful. But I am having a little bit of trouble following this distinction for this new ETSR that's the transmission rights. On the through example, it seems like, I mean, if you go to in the first example where the customer didn't have the rights, all the rights were held by the BAAs, you set it up as, okay, both BAAs share in the transfer revenues in the through example. I guess I just don't understand if the customer has acquired the rights from the BAA, why wouldn't it be the same kind of arrangement where there'd still be the sharing of the revenues between the BAAs, and then the BA that had granted the rights to the customer would then pass on their share of the revenues to the customer?
So in essence, that's what's going to occur. So Doug, you actually are, what's going to happen is this $2,250, $1,125 will go to BAA, $1,225, oh my God, I can't do math in my head, is going to go to BAB, and then it'll be up to those EDAM entities to true up with that transmission customer.
Oh, okay. So I guess I just misunderstood. So BAB presumably would then pass on those revenues to their customer. BAA would allocate them pursuant to whatever methodology, but to their customers, not to the transmission customer of BAB.
Correct. Yeah. So what in this scenario, in order to have the ETSR pair of 3-4, that transmission customer has rights in both to export out of BAB and import into BAA. So he is a transmission, has the rights for this full 100 megawatt transfer. And they're only using 75 of it, so both BAA and BAB will true up with that customer.
Okay, so maybe I didn't understand the explanation. So it sounds like they've acquired rights from both BAB and BAA.
Correct. That's how we would have to do it to establish the rights to self-schedule across that transfer. They have to have rights in both BAs.
I guess I'm having a hard time thinking about I mean, I'm sure there's examples where this is the case, but this wasn't the typical one I was thinking of. Because if you go back to the example before you introduced the customer, your through example, the very first one.
You're going to go back, I think it's 5 slides.
Because I think in these examples, right, it's all the same transmission, right? So
right here,
there's the 100 megawatts from B to A, And this example, it's a through because you needed both B and A to make this happen. And then when you jump to the new example, I think it's the same example. It's just you're saying that a party has those rights between, from, and in my mind, it was from B to A, but not the whole way, just to the star, not all the way to the boundary. And it seems, which I think is a common situation, right? You've got parties that have acquired transmission from a BA, but it's only that BA's transmission. They may or may not have acquired rights on BAA-B system, but they still have those rights from they may not have acquired the rights on BAA-A's system, but they still have the rights on BAA-B. And, maybe that's
so
not
the
the
scenario.
example.
Yeah. So, well, no. So it's actually you're getting into a little bit on the appliance of the perfect hedge. And so under the scenario where you're talking about where they only have the right to basically to the ETSR or the transfer location, the transmission customer would get the perfect hedge from the generator to the ETSR location, the transfer location, and then the transfer revenue would then be allocated to the BAA fully. And this is one of you bring up one of the rationales of why in our straw proposal that we have recommended to give the transfer revenue all to the EDAM entity, because the EDAM entity can then turn around and sub-allocate those transfer revenue to that transfer customer because they have a better understanding as to whether or not that transfer customer should receive that transfer revenue. But what my scenario that I've drawn up where is the transfer customer has rights to also get from the boundary of BAA to load within BAA. So it is, in essence, it's self-scheduling 75 megawatts from the generator to the load. The scenario that you had addressed, it has rights to get the generator to the border. And so what would happen if I have it all the way to the load, they get the perfect hedge from the generator to ETSR1, perfect hedge from the export or ETSR2 to the load, and then that transfer revenue we're going to give to the EDAM entity to now make you whole for that leg between the two transfer locations.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the explanation.
Mm-hmm. And I see our discussion, Doug, has prompted more questions. But so let's go down. I think it's 5 slides to this scenario we're in. Yes. Perfect. And then we'll Todd. Can you open up Todd's line?
Yeah. So I'll unmute his line. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. James, thank you for being so patient with all of us. These are really helpful. I guess my one fundamental question I have on this example is, it seems like the transfer capability between the balancing areas was 100 megawatts, and somehow the 100 megawatts of rights to the third party in bucket 2 is somehow mutually exclusive with the bucket 1, 3 rights. And that doesn't seem to make sense to me. If there's only 100 megawatts of transfer capability between the balancing areas, I don't know how the balancing area B or A could sell 100 megawatts to a third party and still have, extra 100 megawatts. So maybe you can help me understand that.
Sure. So what it means is when they inform us, the ETSR pair 1 and 2, it may have a max capability of 100 or 200 megawatts or 100 megawatts for both sets of pairs. So if all the transmission was made available, they would have had 200 megawatts of transfer capability. However, due to outages or a line re-rate, the line itself has been derated to 100 megawatts. Now, what it means is both of these ETSRs, I can only use up to 100 megawatts total. And so when the transmission customer comes in and self-schedules only 75 megawatts, that means that 25 megawatts can be used by either the ETSR pair 1, 2, or we can turn around and use the unscheduled transmission of ETSR 3, 4. So it's basically competing transfers. And what we determined here was that ETSR pair, the RSC1 has the ability to provide it, or was awarded in essence, the additional 25 megawatts. So now I'm still limiting the transfer to 100 megawatts. I just looked to see what was the ability to provide that extra 25 megawatts. It could have landed on either one. In my scenario here, I made it land on the RS bucket 1 or hurdle-free transmission.
Okay, maybe this is too nitpicky, and your illustration is still valid, but it would seem to me that if you had a D-rate or some kind, I don't know, it didn't make sense that the bucket 2 wouldn't have been pro rata D-rated with the rest, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe this will help clarify it further. Is the ETSRs are? My understanding is that those are limits on net interchange, and they're not necessarily the capability of a specific line or path. Is that correct?
Yes. So your net capability for flow from BAB to BAA is going to be 200 megawatts, but the available transmission to facilitate that is only 100 megawatts, if that helps. But go ahead, you have more to your question.
No, I think that answered it. Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay, moving on to the next caller. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
This is the exact reasons why I wanted to present these examples, is we didn't really get a chance to get into details before, and I think these examples help us really get into the weeds. I think, Callie, I think they're opening up your phone line next.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF again. Actually, I had the same question as Todd did, his first question as to, I was trying to understand why when you added bucket 2 transfer capability that was provided by a transmission customer with rights, why the total transfer capability didn't increase to 200. And I think I heard you said it's because in your example, you're assuming some sort of outages or D-rates. So absent any outages or D-rates, if we have a scenario where bucket 1 transfer capability is provided, and that's to, it's firm transmission procured to support generation for the RSC purposes. And then you have another transmission customer coming in with additional rights in the same direction from BAB to BAA. Again, absent any outages or D-rates, would your example show 200 megawatts of transfer capability?
Yes, and when we get into the next example, we kind of do that. And what you see is the overall solution changes too. You will end up having another 100 megawatts of energy flow from BAB to BAA, because now we have more transmission available to meet the need of BAA's load.
Okay, super helpful clarification on that one. And then I did want to just follow up real quick on a comment you responded to Todd's, I think, second question or through the discussion. You said now in this example, you just picked the extra 25 megawatts to be on the bucket one transmission. You know, they're both hurdle free. So I think this also came up in yesterday's discussion as to whether or not in the actual optimization or in these settlement scenarios, how that extra 25 megawatts, does it get picked to go bucket one first, then bucket two? Or is it some sort of pro rata distribution? Because it sounds, if I'm understanding this correctly, the dollars will flow to different entities depending on if it's bucket one or bucket two. So I think at some point in time, we should have that conversation. I know for your examples, you just mentioned you picked bucket one, but is that a foregone policy decision at this point, or is that just something that we'll need to talk through eventually?
I think it's part of our discussion. I think discussion started yesterday, and I think we need to have continued discussion, and we probably can have it more later on today if we want to, is do we, in essence, put a priority on the transmission? And if you do put a priority on the transmission, you potentially can eliminate some of the concerns for redispatch. And what I mean by that, so if I put a priority on the bucket one, I'm going to use up that first before I use up the unscheduled transmission of bucket two, I don't have, that reduces the concern of a redispatch if the transmission customer comes in the real time and then schedules all the way up to its limit. And I had already used it for optimization the day ahead. This would reserve that right for the transmission customer to use its right all the way through real time without having any implications on redispatch. But that being said, this is a discussion point, and it's nothing, no formal stance has been made on whether or not we should have a priority or not.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, I'll hold that until we get to that discussion. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving on to the next caller. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Ken, I think you're up, and if you're talking, you might be silent on your phone.
Here I am. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Ken, I can.
Yes.
Thanks. So a more general question and comment. I wonder if, James, you and Kaiso have considered, and if you would be willing to offer any guidance in dealing with the complexity in determining actually who is the appropriate transmission customer on each side of a given interchange transaction that should be subject to this settlement. So it's not as simple as the customer that owns that reserved the transmission. I think it's also not as simple as the creating PSE customer. I think typically in EIM we go through a big bowl of spaghetti logic that looks at the PSE inside the border on the inside side of the border on a given interchange transaction and tries to map that. But it seems like that could be problematic in this case where dollars are going to be not equitably distributed. Has this come up in the past before?
This has not come up yet until now, and I would have to go back and think more about it, because I think what you're talking about right now is a lot of the onboarding process, how we make the determination, and yeah, we haven't gone into that detail yet. That's really going down into the details, so we have not touched that topic yet.
Okay, so I guess I'll ask the audience if anyone else has encountered such problems and is thinking maybe that the possibility that the transmission customer is not the same and that each BA wouldn't even necessarily recognize use the same set of logic in determining who the transmission customer is, introduces an additional degree of freedom that kind of allows this thing to really wobble around.
So if any other participant has any opinion to Ken's question, please feel free to speak up or raise your hand.
As a reminder, you can click on the raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. If you are connected to the computer audio, use the call me feature. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 to enter the question queue. You can also submit a question using the chat. To submit written questions, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, enter your question in the message box provided, and send.
Ken, I don't see anybody jumping in, but what we'll do is we'll take your scenario offline and we'll talk internally more about it. We may reach out to you to get more details, if that's okay. I agree with you. Food for thought. All right, the next example, we're going to move on. This one, we have, in essence, you have a transfer constraint, and you also have an internal constraint, and it's the intertie constraint. And under this scenario, the system resource that was previously just self-scheduling at another intertie location is actually bidding in at a scheduling point that is shared by the ETSR. And so we are now going to have to do another evaluation in relationship to how much the ETSR can bring, as well as how much the system resource can provide. And we'll do a market analysis on that. And so, Callie, as you can see, I increased the ATC to 200 megawatts. So bucket 1 has the ability to do its full capability. Bucket 2 has the ability to do its full capability as well. I also increased the export capability from BAA to BAB to 200 megawatts. However, based upon my scenario, we're not going to be using that particular bucket. So if we go on to the next slide, the example changed a little bit. I now have the system resource bidding in the 200 megawatts at $50. The generators bids did not change. The load bid did not change. The bucket 2 transmission customer is still scheduling 75 megawatts of transfer capability to serve load in BAA from generator 4 in BAB, and it's using the bucket 2 transmission to get that 75 megawatts from BAB to BAA. The ISL has a scheduling limit of 300 megawatts. So when we do the solution, we're going to award the transfers, and then we're also going to look at the internal scheduling limit when making a determination on the ability to provide either more transfer or to replace some of that transfer with the system resource. And so given this scenario, if we go to the next slide, our results changed. As you can see, the system resource now, because it had a higher cost than energy in BAAB, it is being limited by the internal constraint, the intertie constraint, to 100 megawatts. And that's because I have ETSR1 transferring 100 megawatts up to its limit. I have ETSR 3 transferring 100 megawatts up to a limit. 75 of that megawatts is used by the transmission customer directly, and 25 has been optimized by the market and has been used to provide additional energy flow from BAB to BAA. Generator 4, because of this new situation, I have to replace that 100 megawatts that was previously awarded to the system resource. Generator 4 is going to output 250 megawatts. It has, in essence, because they bid in at $30, their cost of energy is $30, it's cheaper than the system resources availability or bid of $50, and I have transfer capability to deliver that 100 megawatts. I'm going to replace that system resource energy with the energy from generator 4. Now what this will do is the solution is also causing a $10 internal congestion price for that replacement of energy, because it would have been $50 for the intertie if we had dispatched it, but the LMP is $60. So the internal constraint has been deemed to be delivered, or deemed to be $10 congestion. I can talk would be great. So now if we go to the graphical depiction of this, in BAA, the system resource is paid $6,000 for delivering the 100 megawatts. The generator 2 is paid $30,000 for its energy output. Generator 1 still has its $500 imbalance reserve. The load is still being charged $48,000 for consumption, but now I have ETSR pair 1-2 providing 100 megawatts of energy, so they're being, at the import side, being paid $6,000. ETSR 3, 4 is also delivering 100 megawatts. It is being paid $6,000. So now BAA is now balanced because, in essence, 100 megawatts of transfer capability replaced the system resource because it was cheaper, or more, sorry, not cheaper, it's more economic, is a better way of stating that. Generator 3 got paid still the $15,000. Generator 4 now is paid $7,700. $7,500 is for energy. That's the 250 megawatts of energy at $30. And then $200 for its imbalance reserve. Loads still being charged to $16,500. I now have the two exports, 100 megawatts each. They're both being charged at $3,000. So what this creates is it creates a transfer revenue between the two BAAs on both of these at $2,000, but also we have congestion because of the binding constraint internally of $3,000. Under this mix scenario, the transfer revenue is split 50-50 between the two BAAs. It should be, sorry, that should be $1,000, not $1,500, sorry. And then the congestion rent, hold on, $2,000, not $1,000. Should be $2,000, not $1,500. And the congestion rent should be $3,000, stays within the BAA because that's where the binding congestion is occurring. I apologize for that little error. I thought I had corrected it. I must have missed it. But how we get to the $2,000 is the ETSR pair 1-2 goes $1,000 both to BAB and BAA. ETSR 3, 4 goes both $1,000 to BAB, BAA. The BAAs now make the determination on what transfer revenue should be used to make the transmission customers whole, so that $2,000 would then be allocated out appropriately according to the routes. And now if we go to the next slide, similar if it goes to 2, but instead it's all 4,000. Again, I made the mistake here. All 4,000 goes into BAB, not 3,000. And then the congestion rent of 3,000 stays within BAA. And so I'm going to open it up here for any questions. And I apologize for the 2,000 and the 4,000 error. I'll correct those. I see that Doug is
a caller in the. Yes. Doug, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Doug Bochignone, Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Just a simple question. How is the $3,000 congestion determined? What was the price differences?
So the intertie bid was $50. The energy price within that BAA was $60. So there's a $10 congestion price because we're binding at the ISL, so I can't award the full 200 megawatts to the intertie schedule because it's being replaced by the transfer. So it's a $10 congestion.
But isn't there only 200 megawatts of transfer? So isn't it just
200 megawatts? Well, the 3,000 represents the 100 megawatts of system resource that gets the congestion price as well. So it's 200 for the transfer, 100 for the system resource. That's how I got the 3,000.
Oh, gotcha. I thought it was a total of 200. I missed the transfer being 200 plus 100 on the ETSR 3.4.
Yeah, so you have ETSR 1.2 gets 100 megawatts, ETSR 3.4 is 100 megawatts, and the system resource is 100 megawatts. The constraint that's binding for the ISL will apply to all of those resources.
Gotcha.
So I now have 300 megawatts.
Okay. I was missing the system resource, the location of it. Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Okay. So let's go on to the next slide. So now, the option 1, we can ignore that part. I was trying to figure out ways of asking this question. So, as we stated, is the majority of the comments, they don't like this. They don't like us making that distinction by the transfer location. The majority of the comments was we need to have a consistent methodology across the entire EDAM footprint. And the argument is, and we've had this discussion here, and we've had this discussion before, is regardless of where the transfer location is, both BAAs are providing transmission to facilitate that transfer. And therefore, the comments have been that we need to have a common application of sharing that transfer revenue. Now, the 50-50 again on this is a default mechanism. It can be negotiated to be something differently, but in essence, both BAA and BAB should share in that transfer revenue. But the congestion rent, because it's an internal constraint, it needs to stay within the BAA in which it is binding. So that was a large majority of the comments I received was that should be the direction of the policy and not to make this distinction. And so my questions really are, now that we've had a review of what the original proposal was, if we went to the 50-50, in essence, all of those situations I described, the transfer revenue would be split between the two BAAs. In the first two scenario, it's $1,500 a piece. In the last scenario, it's $2,000 a piece. And then the congestion rents associated with internal congestion would stay within, that we described in the third scenario, would stay in BAA. Now, I want to have a little discussion is, for those, particularly for those that had not made an opinion, do we now agree that we should be going down the route of the 50-50 split, or have basically the consistent methodology, or should we still consider having some distinction based upon the transfer location or the transfer location type? And this one I want to open up to everybody. And I really want to get a discussion as to what we think the fundamental principles are for going to a 50-50 and the fundamental principles for making a distinction. Now, I'm hoping.
Okay, I do see a caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Morning, James. Hi, James. Jeff Spires of PowerX. Like others have mentioned, thanks for walking through these detailed examples. But I think now is a good time probably to back it up a level as you're kind of posing the broader question. You know, the first thing is, from my perspective, I think when EIM, in the context of the EIM, and I think that's kind of where people are starting from when they're thinking about this, I think the concept of 50-50 between two EDAM BAs makes sense for the reason that in those cases, really what you have is some amount of transmission secured from the export side, matching up with some amount of transmission on the importing side. So you've got, you know, transmission service exporting from the first BA and then transmission service coming into the receiving BA. And so to the extent that there's a transfer that occurs between those two BAs, splitting that 50-50 is logical, and it's easy to understand that. And you know, certainly it could be the same customer that has the rights on both sides, so to speak. You could have a single transmission customer that happens to own both rights from the exporting BA and rights from the import into the importing BA. But you know, regardless of who the customer is that is entitled to those rents, just conceptually saying we have value, we're going to split it 50-50 between the export and the import, recognizing they're both bringing transmission to the table to support that. I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's pretty simple, and it's consistent with what happens today in the EIM. Listening to this conversation and looking at all the different examples, I really think the complexity, for the most part, is related to the CAISO interties, and in particular, the example you had laid out at the end around congestion that's calculated on the CAISO interface and how that interacts with transfer revenue. I'll admit I had a little bit of a hard time following the example and some of the calculations in the last couple, but I want to just ask a question with even a more simple example to make sure I understand what the proposal would be under bullet 1. So, you know, let's just start with a really simple example. Imagine you have a Northwest EDAM BA that has a price of $30. And let's say the CAISO BA is at 50. So there's $20 of congestion between those BAs, and all you have is a single ETSR a transfer on the Pacific DC. So just trying to keep it as simple as can be and consistent with some of the conversations we've had in the past. So in that instance, you have $20 of congestion between the BAs. You have this transfer on the DC, single line, single path. If the CAISO software says, okay, the price at knob is 40, so right in the middle. So you've got $30 in the Northwest, $50 in California, and your knob price, which is essentially in the middle of the DC line, is at 40. It sounds like what your proposal would do is it would say that in that scenario, the CAISO would receive $15 and the rights holder on the external segment getting to knob would receive $5. Is that accurate?
I'm going to ask you a quick question. I know you're addressing it as all congestion rent. Which is binding? Are we saying that the knob represents the binding between of the transfer constraint, and then the difference between knob and Fillmore represents the internal ISL constraint, intertie constraint?
Well, yes, that's the question I'm asking, is that based on the way that you're articulating this, it sounds like the proposal would be that CAISO would make that determination about what is the amount of congestion at knob, and then use that to distribute the funds from there, where it would say, okay, the congestion up to knob, so from the $30 Northwest entity up to knob, that first $10 of congestion is split 50-50, but then the congestion that it's calculated at knob into the CAISO BA would be kept by the CAISO BA. So if I just do the math on that, I get to $15 goes to the CAISO and $5 goes to the rights holder on the northern segment of that DC line. And so maybe I'll stop there. Just that's the sort of starting point based on my understanding of the way this would work. If you use the proposal to share what you're referring to as the transfer revenue, which I'm sort of interpreting as the northern segment, but have the CAISO BA receive 100% of the intertie congestion, which I am referring to as that, based on that knob price of $40 in this example.
Okay, so the first bullet that we have here, this is the bullet that are coming from the comments. We haven't formally, the ISO hasn't come with a formal decision as to which direction we're going, and that's why we're having this discussion. But based on your example, if we adopt the first bullet, then yes, because transmission was provided by both the ISO and the other BAA to get to knob, then that transfer revenue would be split 50-50. Now, once that energy gets beyond that transfer location and gets to the scheduling point internal to the ISO, if there's additional internal constraint that's binding, then that internal constraint should remain within the BAA. Now, what I want to, what the first bullet is recommending is that this would be something that could be applied to all BAAs, so that if we do have EDAM BAAs that eventually fall under the same condition, let's say we start allowing intertie bids in EDAM BAAs, the same condition can arise, and the same result would occur. And so that's the question that I'm trying to tease out here is, do we feel that we should start looking at the direction that has been recommended by the comments, or should we still continue with the distinction that the ISO had proposed in our initial proposal?
I appreciate that explanation, and I would make the case, and obviously not speaking for others, that when the feedback is that it's more equitable to split that 50-50, I think that discussion's really quite often in the context of thinking about what I said towards the beginning, where you have two EDAM BAs, they're both contributing transmission, some on the export, some on the import. There's value across that path that the EDAM creates, and there's an opportunity to share that in an equitable way. I really think that that's what people mean by this concept. I think the reason I'm asking this question is because, like I said, the interties on the CAISO, with the CAISO, have a complexity that others, at least in today's world, don't have. And based on the example we were just talking about, it seems that even in a situation where you have a $20 transfer in terms of the value, and even if the knob price was perfectly in the middle, you still end up with the CAISO receiving 75% of the value, and I think that's pretty challenging. And much like we've said before, it really seems like the right answer is to take a look at that outcome and say, these are particularly on the major lines on the AC and the DC. These are coordinated interties. There's $20 of congestion on that path between the combination, however you want to classify that. There's $20 of value for a transfer that's going from the Northwest into California. There are rights holders that are both on the northern segment and on the southern segment, and their rights are being used to support that transfer. So the equitable thing to do is to take that $20 and split it equally between the rights holders that are on the northern segment and the rights holders are on the southern segment, as opposed to relying on the software to calculate a price at knob and then saying, okay, we're going to use the allocation based on that. I think, as we've said in the past, this is an opportunity to have an equitable and a durable outcome where you recognize that value of that transfer and allocate that to the rights holders that are contributing to allow for that transfer to occur in a way that's, in my mind, much more consistent with what the approach would be between the other EDAM BAs. So I do think that needs to be part of the conversation here, because it's difficult to parse that nuance out of the examples, and I think that that's really where the crux of the complexity lies with respect to the CAISO interties.
And Jeff, I agree. This is the reason for the workshop, is to have this discussion. And I believe we have two other people in queue that probably want to add to this discussion. So I'd like to, if okay, Jeff, I'd like to move on and let
Yes.
Doug speak.
Thanks, James.
Doug, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you, Doug Bocignone for BANX. I think it was a great question by Jeff. But I think what you would find is, in the example, the ISL constraint value would be lower than what it wouldn't be at the same, $10. I think most of the value's going to end up being on the ETSR. So, and you have to recognize that it's not just the ISL. How do I want to say it? The value at the ISL also reflects internal constraints within the ISO. So, you can't just say, oh, we got to take that value and somehow share it, because that's, going across, to serve the load in the BAA, and it isn't just reflecting a single constraint. And I think, as James just said, this would be true for all EDAM BAAs, whether or not there's any scheduling or bidding at the interties, because, all the BAAs have their own internal constraints. So I do think it makes sense to have each BAA manage the internal congestion. But I don't think that's a problem, because I think what will end up happening is most of the value is going to get reflected in the ETSR. That constraint is going to pick up the value. So I do think it ends up being the 50-50 sharing does end up being very equitable because as Jeff, you said, many parties brought the transmission that's utilized for those transfers to take place. And it makes sense to allocate the benefits to those parties. But you can still do that and manage the internal congestion.
I don't know if, Jeff, you want to reply to it, but one of the things that I wanted to point out that I agree with Doug on is that the congestion rent at all of these locations, the LMP, the nodal locations, does not reflect just the ISL constraint. It will reflect all internal constraints that may be binding. It is all to be dependent upon the shift factors associated with any of those constraints and that nodal location. So I think Doug brings up a very good point here that congestion rents at the ETSRs and particularly even at the scheduling point for all of the resources reflects more than just the internal ISL constraint. It would reflect any internal constraint.
And James, I just wanted to add to that on the other side, on the ETSR, I think the proposal is to look at the marginal energy cost differences between the two BAAs, but like a system marginal energy cost, and therefore it doesn't include the congestion value. I mean, it's affected by the internal constraints because that determines which resources are marginal and how that value is set. But it itself doesn't include the congestion. And then that's what allows each BAA to then, they're going to get the congestion revenues, the difference between what the generators in their BAA are paid and what their loads and exports are charged. And I think that's how this all works together without double counting or sort of having missing money because you're splitting it apart into the components.
Yes, and that's actually one of the reasons why we want to split it apart into the components. We want to be able to explicitly identify when the transfer constraint's binding versus when it's an internal congestion constraint that's binding. And that's why we have been looking at creating a marginal energy cost for each BAA that would reflect when the energy, basically the transmission constraint is starting to bind or binding, and it is causing the energy cost of one BAA to separate from the other. Whereas today, all of that is embedded in the marginal congestion cost of the congestion rents that we allocate out to the real-time market, the WEIM. Okay, I believe we can reopen the line for Todd Ryan.
Okay, sure. Go ahead, Todd. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Todd, can you hold on a second? I think Jeff wants to respond to Doug. I missed that Jeff raised his hand again. So, Todd, if that's okay, I'd like to hear Jeff's response.
Jeff, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Oh, thank you. I'll be quick. I appreciate Doug's comments. I just wanted to make a couple of clarifications and respond to that. First of all, I don't want to suggest that we're proposing to share, physical congestion within a BA, and I generally agree with the concept of saying, if there's congestion going on within the CAISO or within some other entity, that would be part of their those rents would go back to that entity. But I think what the difference is that I don't agree, though, that on these interties that's really what's going on here. And I think, the DC is probably the most straightforward example where you have a scheduling location of knob that's really a convenience. I mean, it's not an actual point of interchange. It's halfway up the DC line. There really can't be congestion at knob. I mean, if there's congestion on the DC, it would be occurring at the northern end of the line at Big Eddy. And so really that's what I'm trying to say here is that in that instance, to have the software make a determination that there's congestion starting at knob, and what that has the effect of doing is assigning a disproportionate share of the value of the DC line to entities in the CAISO relative to the rights holders that are making rights available on that line from the external systems doesn't seem like the right outcome here at all. And that's really the point I'm trying to make is it's that scheduling congestion where the CAISO software is looking and saying, I'm calculating that there is X dollars of congestion at knob, when the reality is you have all these rights holders bringing their rights into the market to support transfers on a coordinated intertie, and there's value there that should be shared equitably. And, to Doug's point, he sort of made the point, well, it could be that the ETSR ends up binding more frequently or more to a greater degree. I think that's still a good argument to say, shouldn't we be allocating that in a way that's predictable? Because I think the flip side would be if it was the ETSR that started binding more regularly or to a significant degree, then entities that have rights on the DC or on other coordinated interties in the CAISO are going to feel like they're not getting their share. So the 50-50 really helps to just say, look, we get that this is a coordinated intertie. There are multiple rights holders. We need a methodology that is equitable and that is straightforward and durable. So anyhow, thanks for the opportunity to respond to that.
Thanks, Jeff. Now, I just want to make sure that we're, and I know the example you brought up was knob, and I just want to say we're not going to, I make it clear people aren't scheduling at knob. What's happening is the competing for the schedule is actually at Silmar, and that's why the ISL is if it's binding, that's within the ISO balancing authority area scenario, and that the transfer location, we have chosen a transfer location which says that the energy is going to transfer from this BA to the ISO at a specific location. I think you're choosing knob at this point. And then if that's binding, then there's an energy separation of that transfer. The energy itself is all coming into the ISO at Silmar, but the ISO had to provide additional transmission to get from the transfer location that you had chosen in this case, which is knob, to Silmar. So this is a similar situation to every other BAA where you're both providing transmission to get from the transfer location to the BAAs. There's just an additional constraint where you're competing at Silmar with the transfer and the intertie schedules. So I just wanted to throw that in as just a thought, food for thought. But I believe I want to go to Todd.
Todd, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you, James. Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. Hey, I just wanted to follow up on some of my line of questioning earlier. And so, again, the ETSRs are constraints on net interchange. And we've always been showing these as kind of like one-line diagrams. But assume that one of the ETSRs between BAAB and BAA is actually like a set of 3 or 4 lines that make up a path. Tell me, how would it be treated if the upstream side of, I don't know, a transformer or something on the upstream side of one of those lines was binding? Would that be considered internal congestion to BAB?
I'm going to actually ask for a lifeline here. So George Angelides, if he's available, can you help answer this question?
Oh, can you hear me? This is George Angelides.
Yep.
That's George. I can hear you.
Okay. I'm sorry, I wasn't sure. Doug, can you please repeat your question? I'm not sure I understand fully what you were asking.
Yeah, I guess, again, I'm trying to separate out the fact that the ETSR seem to be not tied to a specific constraint. And so I'm trying to parse out when you do have a constraint within a path between balancing areas, how that is treated differently than the ETSR. So just hypothetically, BAA, B to A, the ETSR may still isn't binding, but you have a specific transformer or a specific line that's binding. Is that considered internal generation then?
Yes, if you're talking physical congestion, since you're bringing up physical transmission elements like a transformer, that's physical congestion, right? So physical congestion is seen everywhere on the grid, but it doesn't affect scheduling constructs like a transfer, right? The transfer is a scheduling construct, so it's only affected, its price is only affected by scheduling limits. And you have 2 kinds of scheduling limits. So the one that is on the transfer itself, that basically reflects how much of the transmission capacity is released for the transfer, okay, what we call, transmission rights under the transfer. And the other one is, we have referred to them as intertie constraints, ITC, or intertie scheduling limits, ISLs. These are apply on ISO interties and more generally on other interties with the BAAs. And there are more general scheduling limits that they may constrain multiple transfers plus imports, exports to ISO scheduling points. So those 2 different type of scheduling limits, if they're binding, the shadow price finds its way into the marginal price for the ETSR. And you can see price separation between BAAs when one or both of those constraints are binding on an intertie.
Okay, thank you, George. Very helpful.
Okay, moving on to the next caller. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, let me just, on the previous discussion, I think the example that Jeff Spires was putting forth on an intertie, on the DC intertie, where you had a price separation between, it was BPA, I believe, and ISO $40. That particular example did not have any intertie schedules. It was a simple example where just the transfer between BPA and ISO was binding, and that was creating the $40 split between BPA and ISO. And in this example, the knob is immaterial. It doesn't matter because the scheduling point is not used. There were no intertie schedules at knob. If you only have a transfer, then it's a simple case where you have price separation between the 2 BAAs, and you apply the 50-50 rule, then there's a split of 50-50 between BPA and ISO for the transfer revenue, $40. So that was a very simple example. Knob comes into the picture if you have more complicated examples where you have actual intertie schedules at the knob scheduling point with the ISO. So that's a different example. Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller.
Yeah, thank you, George. We move on to Callie.
Sure. Please go ahead. The line is unmuted.
Hi, Callie Wells again with WPTF. I have what I think is just a quick clarifying question on something it was briefly mentioned a couple callers ago. So did I hear you correctly in that you were saying when these transfer limits are binding now, you're going to see a difference in the SMEC component, whereas today when they're binding, the difference shows up in the congestion component? Is that a change that's coming with EDAM, or did I misunderstand that?
You did not misunderstand it. It's a change that's coming in with EDAM that we are looking to calculate the marginal energy costs for each BAA and not embed it within the marginal cost of congestion. This way we can calculate the transfer revenue as a difference between the energy cost between the two BAs, because that is what results when you have your transfer limit is binding, and any internal congestion would be reflected in your marginal cost of congestion, and therefore it is internal congestion that would be separated out and allocated to the EDAM entity.
Okay, and then are you guys also going to carry that forward into EIM as well?
We won't. We don't have a choice.
Yeah, okay.
Just
always wanted to ask that follow-up. Okay, yeah, I assumed that was the case, but just wanted to ask. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Okay, moving on to the next.
Go ahead.
Yes, we have Peter in the queue. Please go ahead, Peter. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, James. It's Peter. Nice, James. So can you go back to previous slide? I need to understand something about the example. Are you saying that all 3,000 is staying with BAA for congestion?
Yes. Yes.
Well, 1,000 of that congestion is realized on intertie bids for SR, and 2,000 is realized on transfers, right?
Yes, but it's the internal constraint that's binding from the ISL. Go ahead, Clive.
Well, that's highly questionable, and I am on the same page with Jeff Spires. This is not an equitable solution. This is like trying artificially to explain something that is not just and reasonable. I mean, that congestion happened, yes, on ETSRs that are kind of net scheduling points, but there is some transmission that has to be provided for that transfer to go and for that congestion to be realized. And the only just and reasonable solution in this case is to share 2,000 congestions among these transfer entities. I know that you have a significant discussion with KISO PTOs about this topic, but saying the solution that everybody can do this and start artificially creating internal congestion is not a good solution long term, not stable. So I really believe, from what we discussed on day one, the only equitable solution is to reward people who are providing transmission to support this transfer, even when you have congestion.
Okay. I hear what you're saying, and hopefully we have some more responses.
Okay, I do see one more caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, James. Yeah, I kind of agree with Jeff and Peter. And then the other component is Doug Boccioni said, I mean, most of the values on the ETSRs. So I think we're better not having the complexity and keeping it consistent with WEIM, certainly initially. I think that's a better solution, a more equitable solution. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. I believe.
Okay,
Jeff,
I do see.
We have a
yes,
quick question
I
before we go to Jeff Nelson. Todd, your hand's still raised. It's been raised for a while. Did you still have a response? Okay. So if we can move on to Jeff Nelson, that would be great.
Okay, sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, good morning. Jeff Nelson, SCE. Just checking to make sure people can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, I really wish I had all the answers to this. I don't. I struggle with a lot of the definitions that are being used. We raised a series of questions in our comments about how the internal congestion and was being impacted between the ETSR and the transfer valuations. And rather than have the answer, we proposed a framework on how to look at this problem to see if the cash flow was working right. We proposed, I don't want to say it's a no arbitrage sort of framework, but an equivalency framework. And what we propose is, okay, let's just assume BAA-B is sort of an external BAA and BAA-A is the ISO. Let's just assume that. And if someone had generator 3 and they wanted to get it to load 1 in today's market, what would they have to do? They would have to get transmission from generator 3 to the ISO's border, and they would buy that from BAA-B. Okay, there's a cost associated with it. And in buying that, they're now insulated from congestion from the balancing authority to the ISO's border. Now, if their goal is to basically have the LMP at their generator be equal to the LMP at their load, what do they have to do next? They have to get all the way from the ISO's transfer point to their load, and they need to get a CRR that hedges all of that. So if they've got transmission from BAA-B to the border, and they have a CRR from the border to their load, they're fully hedged, and in effect, generator 3 is at load 1 from an LMP or a pricing point. Yeah, there's some loss issues, but just sort of ignore those because we're talking about congestion, not losses. So we basically said whatever we do, we should wind up with that sort of parity. And the money needs to flow back to the people it needs to flow to so that that hedge is maintained in the new world. So I just propose that as a framework, as a sanity check. I say it's not really a no arbitrage equation, but it's an equivalency equation. If I do it today under a certain framework, where does the congestion have to flow and who does it need to flow to provide that hedge? And under the new framework with new rules, where does the money have to flow to make sure that hedge can be maintained? So not an answer, but a framework and what the right way to allocate congestion is. I'll just pause there.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, so let's assume a little bit your example. I'm going to try to answer this in your framework. So the generator, let's say generator 3 to ETSR 1, or in this case ETSR 3, they're using their rights. They would get the perfect hedge to get that energy to that transfer location of the in this case ISO, which is BAA, and the that perfect hedge would be, so they would get the congestion, any congestion internal to BAB if it was there would get reversed out. Now you're getting to ETSR 4, and it's an import into the load. If they have CRRs, then yes, they will get the hedge from the CRR for that congestion, because that's internal congestion that is being used to fund that CRR. Otherwise, it is allocated to the BAA, and the BAA will distribute out. ISO, we currently distribute it out to measured demand. Now, this is another BAA. This congestion could be allocated directly back to the transmission customer to make them whole for that path if they don't have ETC TOR rights to that load. Now, if they have ETC TOR rights in the ISO or anyplace else to get from ETSR 4 to its load, we are going to provide them the perfect hedge, and they don't need the CRR, because we are going to reverse out that congestion for that flow and then turn around and allocate it to measure demand, so the customer is being made whole. A lot of it is really going to be dependent upon that internal congestion. Is it going to use to fund a CRR? Is it used to, if they're using their own internal transmission or using their rights, they'll get the perfect hedge, or the EDAM entity can use that congestion rent to make that customer whole and outside of, based upon their out. So I think it kind of aligns with your framework, Jeff. It's just how we look at it.
Yes. So, I mean, this is where I get stumped, right? Right. I get from generator 3 to my ETSR, and there's some internal congestion, and BAB will get that internal congestion, and they'll be able to flow it back to the transmission holder. Let's assume that the generator has bought all the transmission. So they'll get that. That's great. And then once they get to the ISO's border, and if they have a CRR at the ISO's border, they'll get to their load, they'll be hedged. That's great. But is there the equivalent of a $2,000 price difference? I forget how many megawatts you're using here between ETSR 4.
100, yeah, the 100 megawatts. There's a transfer revenue that is associated with that.
Okay. So the price drops if there's 100 megawatts. It drops by $20 on the right side of ETSR and on the left 3 and on the left side of ETSR 4. So that generator's price drops as it crosses this bridge by $20. And if it does, back to my equivalency, it seems like to maintain this hedge that generator needs to get that $20 somehow.
Okay, I'm trying to think where the $20 is coming from. But
well, I was dividing $2,000 by 100, and hopefully I took off the right amount of zeros, and that implies a $20 transfer revenue.
So yeah, okay, thank you. So what it is they should get the transfer revenue eventually moved back to them through the BAA. So they should be made whole for that $20. They should also be made whole from the $10 of the congestion through BAA. So now the cost of energy should be $30 to go from generator 3 all the way to load 1. So it's a mechanism to ensure that that transmission customer is made whole. It's just by doing the split, we're making sure that the transmission customer is being made whole for both the transfer constraint finding as well as an internal constraint finding. So in essence, the customer should be made whole all the way through.
That's my proposed framework. I mean, it's a test to make sure if the dollars are working right. You're saying it is. It's still not clear to me. It's not clear to me exactly how that works with the transfer revenue. We also raised questions if it was at all correct to look at the difference between SMECs to determine the transfer revenue. We even have a footnote in there really questioning if the math works out the same, because it really seems like, that the SMECs have all sorts of impacts of congestion baked into them, even if they don't have congestion in them. The marginal price is reflecting the constrained dispatch. So they're reflecting all sorts of internal congestion costs. And it just doesn't feel right. It just feels that, back to my hedging thing, that price shouldn't include all those congestion costs. It should just include constraint costs. So I'm going to stop because, again, we're really struggling with this, but I want to propose that framework on an equivalent hedge today for that generator, where in effect the generator is seeing the same price as the load by buying transmission and by getting a CRR. Whatever framework we have, it should be a sanity check to make sure that hedge continues to work in the new framework if they buy the transmission and they buy the CRR. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think George has raised his hand because he would like to jump into this conversation.
Thank you, James. This is George Engels with the ISO. I just wanted to clarify what we mean by ISO and ITC, those scheduling limits. The example here is showing one. So we have said that early on in the work groups. And it is something that we already have in EIM, by the way. We didn't invent it here. The limit, the scheduling normal and transfer reflects the transmission rights that are released by the transmission customer or the transmission owner for use by the market. Those limits we call ISL and ITC. They're totally different. They're not related to transmission rights. These limits are internal to the BAA, and they reflect reliability limits. They're simultaneous power transfer capability limits. In some cases, there are nomograms involved. In some cases, stability considerations. And they're usually more general limits constraining multiple transfers. So they're not the same thing. And that's why you have a different treatment in the proposal. We have the transfer revenue because of a binding scheduling limit on a transfer because the rights that are listed are fully used. And this is the typical case of the 50-50 split for that transfer revenue. And then you have, as shown in this example, an ISL that is binding, which is a different kind of scheduling limit. It doesn't relate to the transmission rights that are listed in the market. It's more a reliability limit. And if that is binding, it's constraining multiple transfers potentially and other schedules as shown here, the import from the system resource. And this is an internal BAA limit, and that's why it's not strange to have in the proposal that revenue collected because of such a binding transmission scheduling limit has the same allocation with congestion that incurs with the BAA. So I wanted to clarify that. On the other issue, the discussion that recently James and Jeff had, the possibility for having, in this example, generator G3 getting a full hedge for its schedule and transmission to load 1 is still possible here with the setup that we have because G3 requires transmission, intertype transmission between BAH, B, and A. It can release this transmission as bucket 3, and if this is characterized as an existing contract, it can actually self-schedule the transmission, or it can get the transfer revenue for that, and that will provide the hedge that we're looking for. So this is also a workable way to have generator G3 essentially achieve the price that L1 is going to pay for the energy. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I very much appreciate your answer. I don't know if Jeff, his hand's still raised. I don't know if you want to respond to.
Just to thank you. Just to thank you. I mean, again, it's a paradigm that I'm still struggling with reconciling the before and after. But you know, G3, if they buy transmission today, they get, you know, they get through the balancing authority B, and they get to the scheduling point at the ISO. I'm just going to assert that's what their transmission rights do in my hypothetical. So it seems that in order to be hedged, as they are today, they need to get the internal congestion in BAB, right? And they need to get the congestion that's associated with the transfer revenue to get them to the ISO scheduling point. And then from there, they have a CRR from the scheduling point to L1. So, you know, so hopefully I'm seeing this right. I think that's what you guys are saying. But thank you for sort of looking at it through the lens of maintaining a hedge before and after without having to buy anything new.
Yeah, that's the purpose, is to provide, if you're a transmission customer that has bought in the scenario you described, is to provide them the perfect hedge. So I'd like to move on to Ken Donald, please.
Go ahead, Ken.
I can be quick about it. I'm compelled to bang on my drum one more time. I'm also wanting to endorse the previous commenter's thoughts about maintaining the equitability of how it exists in the day-ahead market today. I think that that's the correct thought. And just add that, extend my comments from the other day about valuing transmission and made available to EDAM. If that transmission made available to EDAM always includes a P-node, source, and sink, then its value in terms of the congestion day-ahead market is clear. There are no more unknowns. There's no more need for additional concepts or tricks or knowing whether it's to or through. So I think really smart people like William Hogan have figured this out already, and it's really just up to us to implement a design which follows sound economic principles already established. I won't ask for an answer to that. I just think that we may be getting a little too tricky here.
I want to thank you for your comments. I really do appreciate it. I'd like to, if we can, make this as simple as possible. I'm a settlements guy. So, if possible, let's move on to Doug Boccioni, and then we'll go to, if there's any comments in the chat that I've not seen, we'll raise those, and then I think we're all at a moment for a break.
Please go ahead, Doug.
Boccioni for Vanex. Can we go back to one slide to Jeff Nelson's example? Because I think there is a little bit of a distinction we need to make, because, from the generator to the ETSR, there, if you have the rights, you'd be getting the perfect hedge, which is a congestion reversal. And likewise, let's skip the middle part. If you have the rights on BAB from ETSR2 to the load, you would also, and you had congestion CRRs, you would get congestion revenues. But the piece in between, the ETSR is different. It's a marginal energy cost difference, and it's stripped out congestion. So it's just like, the value of the way I'm thinking of it, maybe it's too simplistic, but it's like the cost to serve the last unit of load in BAB compared to the cost to serve the last unit of load in BAA. But the energy component only, it's stripped out all of the congestion and losses. And so I think what Jeff is asking for is, it's not exactly achievable, but I think you get as close to being to what he wants as possible. And I think it can be done in a way that it works without someone having to have all the rights from, the source to the sink. You could have various components, and those various rights holders could be compensated appropriately. And then just the other, to George's comment about the ISL, I think that, to me, the critical question is, are the flows from the ETSRs, to the extent they're impacting on that constraint in the same manner as the non-EDAM intertie schedules, then it seems like you need to reflect the impacts of that, which is, I think, what George described. If they're not, if they're somehow sort of deemed to be separate, then it seems like you would end up with something more like what Petter and Jeff Spires were arguing for, where instead of the transfer revenue being $2,000, it would be $3,000. But I think what George described, it's the reason the transfer revenue is $2,000 is the price, instead of paying the ETSR 2 and 4, instead of it being $6,000 payment, it's really only $5,000 because that ISL is binding.
I was up to you till the end there, Doug, but Thank you for your comment. I have to think about what you said.
Okay.
I don't know. Is there any comments in the chat?
No comments in the chat besides the one, actually just got one right now from Ken Donald. He said, if every piece of transmission made available to EDAM included P node source and sync attributes, its value could be calculated the same as CRRs. The EDAM designs please follow established marginal pricing energy market principles instead of trying to invent settlement shortcuts.
I agree with you, Ken. We are trying to come up with sound fundamental principles from the market, and then settlement is trying to ensure that we apply those fundamental principles and providing the equitable solution or settlement of the energy. So I do agree with you there. I think this was a great. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do see one caller in the queue right now.
Oh, Tedder, you popped back up. Hi, Tedder.
Please go ahead.
To comment on George's comment, yes, ETSRs are new constructs, but they are actually including actual transmission. I mean, when you see in EIM what people are assigning to ETSRs, they are actually intertized. And I know that in EIM, George is checking both those limits and physical limits. So this is not wireless transfer. So some artificial concept with wireless transfer that there is no congestion. And then, treating ETSRs on CAISO side, specifically with ITCs, doesn't make sense. I mean, they are competing with SRs, but they are different and they have to be treated equally on CAISO BA side like everybody else. And that's why it's very important that congestion is shared on ETSR transfers between BAAs, because those transfers will not happen without reciprocity on putting transmissions on both sides of those.
Okay, Peter. I appreciate your comments, and we'll take that into consideration. I don't know if George wanted to jump back in and respond. Otherwise, I think this is a good moment for a break. We've had some great discussions here and great things to think about. George, do you have anything you want to respond to?
Just really quick, James, I don't want to hold this process. I just want to mention that it's possible that you can have this ISL that is shown in the example here being binding without having any kind of the transfers being binding. So you could simply have some level of transfer that is still within the transmission rights, so the scheduling limit doesn't hit on the transfer, yet all the transfers and the intertie schedules come up to the limit of the ISL. So now you have congestion revenue collected on the ISL that has nothing to do with the limited use of a transfer under a scheduling limit. So obviously this is a different constraint, and it doesn't, any revenue that you have because of that constraint is not related to what we're trying to solve here regarding transfer revenue. It's not transfer revenue. So it's a completely different revenue. It falls under a different category. Thanks.
Well, thank you, George. I think we've had some great discussions. We've been discussing for 2.5 hours now. I need to take a quick, I guess we're doing a 10-minute break, and come back around, actually, let's just come back at 10:45. So it's just under 15 minutes. Gives me a chance to get some water and stretch my legs. I hope everybody else has a chance to do the same. I look forward to talking to you at 10:45, and we're going to discuss a little bit on the sub-allocation. I'd like to hear just points related to sub-allocation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for those we just returned back from our 15-minute break. We will go ahead and proceed for the next few topics. Just keep in mind, panelists, you're on mute, so make sure you unmute yourself before speaking. And we would also take questions, so please use the raise hand icon during the call.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope everybody had a chance to stretch their legs and get some coffee or water. That was a good discussion, and we really do appreciate all the feedback from you. It gives us more food for thought. But I believe everybody is having basically the same intent. We want to come with equitable solutions for in EDAM implementation, and we're all going to strive for that. So leading on from there is in the stakeholder comments, we had several people request that as part of the working group, we discuss the distribution of the transfer revenue and subsequently the congestion rent, more focused on the transfer revenue. Who should be distributing it to the transmission customer? Should it be the ISO directly, or it should through the EDAM entity? And so let's go to the next slide. Now, with the draft straw proposal, the ISO recommends that we stay in alignment with WEIM here. We allocate it to the EDAM entity or EDAM BAA, and then we allow the EDAM BAA to sub-allocate it to its transmission customers. And I think part of our discussions earlier today actually lead toward that being the better option. One, it's the BAA has a better understanding of or more visibility on the transmission customers' rights and the amount that they used. It creates a consistency between EDAM and WEIM. I'm not sure where the L came from. And then it actually ensures that the transmission customer is being held harmless, and it will pay them and according to the route and ensure that the transmission customer who uses right or had bought that transmission receives the equitable transfer revenue and congestion rents to ensure that they are not harmed. So that was the fundamental principles behind allocating it to the EDAM entity. I believe some of our discussion backs that, but as I said earlier, there was a request to discuss it, and I think this is an opportunity to do so. So if we could please go to the next slide. What I wanted to go into is who is in a better position to sub-allocate the transfer revenue to the transmission customers. Do we believe it's what are the fundamental principles why it should go to the EDAM DAA for sub-allocation via their oath? And then why some of the transmission customers believe that the ISO is in a better position to perform that sub-allocation. I think we've already answered the second question. Matter of fact, I know we did, so we can actually ignore it. I was trying to elicit the discussion about the unscheduled transmission that a transmission customer, let's say in our scenario, had 100 megawatts transmission and only used 75. There was 25 megawatts of unscheduled. I believe we've already addressed who we think that the allocation should go to. that the transmission customer should be made whole. The question again goes to the first one. Does it go through the entity or does it go through the ISO? And then the congestion rents, we've kind of touched on this as well. And one of the things I note here is that when the congestion rents at the ISO, what we do with the day-ahead market is we first use that congestion to fund our CRRs, and then it is sent to measure demand. With the EDAM BAA, the EDAM BAA is going to allocate this congestion rents as it deems aligns with its out. And I believe this discussion here might lead into a different area, but let's take this discussion with validity. And I'd like to start with why we should potentially allocate the transfer revenue directly to the transfer customer versus allocating it through the EDAM BAA. As I said earlier, I really believe that the discussions from yesterday and today kind of lead toward that that our original proposal is the correct direction, but I'd love to hear why transmission customers think it should be directly to them. There's not a lot of slides, so the only other bit of slides are basically bringing up one of the examples we already discussed. So if you want to go to the next two slides. One more? Can we move one more slide, please? There we go. We had this slide up many times, so the difference is the 75 megawatt cell scheduled by transmission customers, 25 is optimized by the market. The question is, who should receive the transfer revenue? Should we send to the EDAM entity or directly to the transmission customer? Same with the congestion rents. Should we have a direct allocation, or should we have it go to the EDAM entity and the EDAM entity allocate out to the OAKS? So it looks like Harley Page, you've raised your hand.
Yes. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, my name's Carly Page. I work at the Nevada PC, and I guess I don't have a concern to express as far as opposing or supporting this proposal to have the EDAM entity / the BAA allocate these funds. It is my understanding that the BAA does not have money per se, and they're not the actual owner of, for example, the OAT. I understand that they overlap in almost all cases with the transmission service provider, which holds and is responsible for the OATs and thus the rates for transmission. I'm just kind of struggling with who is going to be passing money back and forth between market participants.
So the ISO are, yeah, I think it's partially we're referring to the same people, but I'm referring to using terminology that we've had when they like a join a BAA join. But what ends up happening is the ISO will settle the energy as I described here previously. Now I have calculated this transfer revenue. Now this transfer revenue, we are going to allocate it to somebody. It either can be a direct allocation if we associate the transmission customer directly to specific ETSRs, it can be a direct allocation to them. Or when I refer to the EDAM BAA, it's basically the transmission provider associated with that BAA will have an association to the ETSRs. and we will take that transfer revenue and we will make sure it goes to the transmission provider and have the transmission provider sub-allocate it to their transmission customers according to the route. I refer to that as either EDAM VA or EDAM, but in essence, it's the same group of, or same individual or same company that would be doing that sub-allocation. And Carly, you're back on. Okay, yeah.
I guess, does this require some kind of OAT change for that entity to be allocating new types of funds?
I'm actually going to defer that to the entities, but I believe that from a theoretical, they should not have to, because it can be considered. Right now, let's put it this way: in the real-time market, they take their congestion rents and they allocate it according to the L. They potentially can, consider the transfer revenue similarly, but I'm not really involved in their oath language. So it really would be dependent upon the oath itself as to whether or not they consider it the same and will follow the same allocation methodology, or if they have to come up with new oath language and file it with FERC and the respective parties. I know it's not a great answer, but I think that's probably the most adequate answer I can give you at this time.
Okay, that's helpful. I guess this is a little broader of a concern probably than this specific slide and this specific issue of rent allocations, but just personally, me speaking, it makes me a little nervous to go into such a complicated process without a uniform plan for whether and how like a dozen entities have to change their oath. I kind of want to know that really early.
And I think that's maybe something that was one of the topics that was raised as part of the comments, is should there be a uniform language that should reflect how this is allocated through the transmission service provider. And I'm actually, I don't think the ISO, my personal opinion, I don't think the ISO should dictate that. I believe this is a discussion that has to come by the EDAM entities or the transmission service providers as to how they want to align their allocations. And what we've seen in the past is they have worked together and they have come up with a pretty consistent allocation methodology. I just don't believe, that we should be dictating that. Well, thank you, Carly. I don't see anyone else raising their hand. I actually expected this to have a lot more discussion. With the lack of comments and questions, it sounds like everybody's in agreement that we should do it to the EDAM entity. Hey, Doug and Stuart popped up. So, Doug, if you could please unmute Doug's line.
Hi, Doug Boccignone for BAMX. Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I'm sort of thinking about what Jeff Nelson said about, how a party gets a hedge from, the resources it contracts with. And, in the CAISO today, we have CRRs, and some of them are at the interties, and, they sync at the loads. And I think, if we go to this approach for the EDAM, we need to look at allocating not just the congestion revenues to the CRO holders, but also allocating transfer the ISO share of the transfer revenues. And the reason I say that is I think what's going to happen is we're going to see a shift, or let me put it another way. The reason why we had CRRs is to provide a hedge for those import transactions. Well, some of those are going to be displaced by the transfers, but nonetheless, and they won't necessarily be impacting on the intertie constraint, but they will be representing, potential exposure to price differences that the ISO importers face, and likewise any other party in any EDAM BAA. So I think for the ISO, it makes sense to incorporate into the CRR settlements the ISO share of the transfer revenues.
Well, thank you, Doug. And actually, you bring up a very interesting discussion point here, because if we tie back to discussion point yesterday, it was raised that should the transition revenue requirements be reduced by transfer revenue, or should the transfer revenue be considered similar to congestion that should go back to the CRRs? And this is one of the questions I think is going to have some fluidity to it. The other portion of this is, should other BAAs consider having CRRs as well? And so I'm glad you raised this discussion.
Yeah, and I just a follow up on what you just said. I think in a way it does align, because the CRRs in the ISO anyway only go from sources to sinks, and the WAC revenues are only going they're generated by exports, and you can't get unless you buy them in the auction, you can't get an export CRR. So I think you can have both true. You can have CRRs that could get a share of incoming transfer revenues, and you could also have for the export direction transfers, those revenues could go towards offsetting the TRR. And remember, this happens today. To the extent there aren't the CRRs sold, the excess congestion revenues go into a balancing account that ultimately is used to as a credit against the TRR.
Excess goes to excess congestion that's collected actually is allocated measure demand.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that last part. You trailed off.
I'm sorry. So if the way the CRR work right now, whatever congestion rents we collect in the ISO, we use that to pay the CRR. Any congestion rent that's left over is then allocated to measure demand in the ISO. So it isn't.
Okay, I guess that's a fair point. I guess I'm treating that as effectively offsetting transmission costs.
Okay, and that's fair. I just want to make sure that people don't misunderstand that, which is great.
Thanks for the clarification.
Stuart, Kelly, please, if you can open his line.
Please go ahead.
James, I don't disagree. We're pushing the revenues back to the EDAM BAA to distribute. Obviously, as long as we have all the information, and if Ken Donald's still listening, Ken, you made some comments earlier, and you may want to opine on, exactly what we need to then do the sub-allocation if you feel that anything's missing. And I think keeping this as simple as possible and consistent with what's currently happening and WEM facilitates that. But Ken, Donald, anything that you would want to reiterate or add just in terms of having the information to sub-allocate?
I'm waiting for a few seconds here to see if Ken pops up.
Or even Fong, is he there?
I don't see it, Stuart, so if we don't have anybody who wants to provide more comments on transparency, we can always have them send an email to me or to Milos, and it'll give us something to consider.
James, do you want me to unmute Ken's line?
Sure. If he has, well, actually, yeah, sure, I'll unmute him, and if he has nothing to add, then that's fine.
Okay, sure, I'll unmute. Please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I'm
Ken, I don't know.
Yeah, so speaking sort of informally for LADWP, left to their own means of deciding what transmission customers get revenue from donated transmission, they would, I think, try to follow a clear path of who did the transmission belong to? Was it their own or was it another customer's already? And what was the value of that based on the source and sink MCCs in whatever hours it was made available to EDAM? But the concern is that amount going to be consistent with what the EIMBA itself is receiving from CAISO? Because if we can't do the right thing on our side if we are only receiving half of that amount of money from CAISO itself.
Okay, so if as part of the onboarding process, we would establish the specific ETSRs. You and the other and the two BAs would be able to align which transmission customers are associated with those ETSRs. And so when we do the transfer revenue, if we do the 50-50 split, it is going to be responsible of both BAAs to take that transfer revenue and distribute it to those transmission customers based upon the dollars that we provide you. So it actually becomes a dual responsibility of the transmission providers of both BAAs, because they should have an idea or align what transmission customers are associated with those ETSRs. I think
right,
you'll have.
I'll give you our calculations indicate that a transmission customer should receive $1,000 from a given transmission set or something, but yet the CAISO is only given LA $500, and we're stuck in a really bad place. So if there isn't going to be consistency among what the BAs do and what CAISO is doing, then on the BA side, we're limited to, well, all we can do is distribute the amount of money that we're given, right or wrong, and that may leave sort of a sour taste to some customers.
I hear you, but and so that goes into the distribution of the transfer revenues. If that transmission customer has the rights to, in this case, ETSR 1, then you're going to compensate that transmission customer based upon their half, in essence, ETSR 1's portion of that transfer revenue, and the ISO would do it on the ETSR 2. So I hear what you're saying, but again, it comes down to providing that transmission. That transfer revenue has a cost for both BAAs providing that transmission. And so the dollar value we provide you should be adequate, Ken. I think it should be inconsistent with what you would have calculated that they should get. I don't see any revenue inadequacy here, but I appreciate your comments.
Okay, I appreciate the work that's gone into this. Thank you.
Yeah, and Ken, I'm sure when we're doing onboarding, we'll have more discussions on it. So, Kathleen Colbert, if I believe you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks, James. Can you hear me?
Yes, Kathleen.
Yes, we can.
Awesome. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just wanted to share a couple very informal thoughts for you to consider and for all of us to consider. First, I want to acknowledge that I think this is a very challenging question. So I know you were mentioning expecting more discussion. I absolutely think we need more discussion on this. Might need more time I definitely need time to digest what we've talked about over the last couple days. So I would, just make a simple ask that let's keep bringing this topic up and having those discussions, and I know we will. But I think that would these conversations yesterday and today will help flesh it out more. But a couple of the reasons that I'm struggling with the question and any thoughts to share is first. So the first thing is I see a distinction being made that I believe has a meaning for the CAISO, but that doesn't necessarily have meaning for me. The distinction that you're flagging of self-schedules that a transmission customer submits versus that's optimized by the market. I'm just really honestly, I struggle with that because self-schedules are optimized by the market, as everyone knows. So the phrasing maybe is catching me a little bit. But I also think that whether or not a transmission customer self-schedules or submits another kind of an economic participating offer into EDAM, it is pretty irrelevant. What's more relevant to me is that we've been talking about how do we ensure that we can, maximize the benefits that EDAM would produce through incentivizing whether it's network customers or transmission customers to consider making that transmission that they hold available to the EDAM. And a big part of what our perspective that we've been bringing is that, well, we need to ensure that transmission customers, in addition to the network customers that, we were talking about the uplift mechanism yesterday, are also incentivized to consider donating their transmission rights for optimization. Whether or not how they decide to transact in EDAM is a separate issue, but to incentivize them to donate that transmission for optimization. But to do so, I do think that donation has to be paired with some kind of compensation analogous to what we talked about yesterday. So in my mind, I think about what our options we discussed yesterday, the uplift mechanism, as being something that both a network customer can say, here's my forecasted or estimated foregone short-term revenues, as an example we talked about, but also a transmission customer to say, I have this is the amount of transmission I have rights for, here's my upfront investment, I'm willing to donate it if you make me whole to this. And in SCE's proposal, if I understood it correctly, would include in that calculation an offset for these transmission revenues. So I do think that so I have to think through that more, right? If that's the approach, then the transfer revenue, you would at least need, even if you allocated it directly to the EDAM entity, to support your uplift mechanism for the transmission customer. If it were to include the offset for transmission revenues, you would need at least the EDAM entity to follow back up with you after the fact and provide that breakout of the transfer revenues that was allocated to, let's say, network customers versus a transmission customer, so that you could do that uplift mechanism approach for those donated transmission customer rights as well. But those are new things that I'm thinking through more. So, and I'm not sure where the CAISO is going to move forward on that. So once I do have a better sense of, okay, are we taking the approach that includes the offsets for transfer revenues? Are you going to allocate it and need that information to come back to you, or can you do this in some way and have the transfer revenue allocated to the TC that you would then already have the information where you wouldn't need an after the fact reporting mechanism? But I'm also incredibly sensitive to the TSP has the information, the best information, and that creates a new, I think if you wanted to implement this, it may be administratively easier to have the allocation be done by the TSP, but I would love to hear more feedback, and I'll look at comments and that TSP submit on that. But that would be, I think there's a practical aspect to it as well. But those are some of the thoughts that we're having as I'm thinking through this, and it's connected to some of the other elements of the proposal. I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think you pointed out a lot of things that that we just kind of discussed. There's a lot of complexity to this, and based on yesterday's discussion on whether or not transfer revenue or a portion of that transfer revenue should be used to offset TRRs versus going back directly to the transmission customer, I think that is an ongoing discussion that we're going to have. The ISO doesn't have a stance on it quite yet because these are relatively new topics on the idea of splitting transfer revenue up. And so I don't have an explicit direction or idea of how the ISO is going to take this right now. And I think that is the correct discussions we need to have, is if there is a need to make a distinction, then we need to have the discussions how you make that distinction, and is it appropriate to have the EDAM entity to make that distinction or have it be the ISO. Personally, based on the complexity of it, I think it's probably the most appropriate to have the EDAM entity making that distinction. And then when it comes to ISO, we'll have to figure out how to align our distinction with the rest of the EDAM entities. So I think you're bringing us a lot of great points, Kathleen. I think they're all relatively new ideas, particularly that transfer revenue might have to be split in how it's being used. But I don't have an official stance on this at this point.
No, thank you, James. I'll just read more discussion on this after we've had more time to digest it and kind of get a sense of that direction. Would be greatly appreciated, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kathleen. Stuart, your hand's still raised. I don't know if you had more to add. Oh, there you go. Did we have any comments in the chat? I see we have one.
But I don't think I'm going to read them out loud at this time. But unless
I agree.
James,
I think,
yeah, okay.
I think a couple of these comments are directed to me. So.
Yeah, so we can go ahead and no comments at this time.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. If we don't have any other discussions on this topic, I think we can move to the next steps. I want to thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you, James. So we can go ahead and go for the next steps for this. For everyone's awareness, we do have an EDAM workshop scheduled for the upcoming 2 sessions. We're hosting them in person and virtual in Salt Lake City, Utah on July 26th from 9 to 5 p.m. Mountain Time. The topics that we'll focus on the first day will be on confidence in transfers, and then greenhouse gas accounting, and then the day ahead RSE and transmission recap review from the prior workshops. And then on July 27th, we also have a workshop in person and virtual in Salt Lake City from 9 to 12, so half day for just greenhouse gas accounting. But if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and register for those workshops. Those information is located at the Extended Day Ahead Market Stakeholder Initiative webpage. And our last slide here today to present is that we are hosting the Stakeholder Symposium in person at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento on November 9 and 10. At this time, we encourage you to take advantage of the early bird discount that will be applied at checkout. Feel free to attend and register today so we can go ahead and have you ready for our symposium that we're having this year. If you do have any other direct questions in regards to the symposium, please direct them to the symposium right at kaiseo.com. But at this time, I'll send it back to my event producer, Shreya, to conclude this call for us today.
Thank you, Brenda. That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.